Welcome everyone to Jacob and His Children, A Journey Through Genesis with Rabbi David Silber. We will be starting today with Genesis 40. Students are encouraged to follow on in the Tanakh of their choice. However, we will be sharing psukim from Sefaria. It's a pleasure to have this continued series with Rabbi Silber on going through Genesis. If you are joining us on Zoom, please, just one point of housekeeping. If you are not actively speaking, can you please mute yourself? Otherwise, we get some strange audio artifacts and feedback. Otherwise, I strongly encourage people to turn on their camera. Do ask questions. You can ask them in the chat, both on Zoom and on Facebook Live. They will be monitored, and I'll make sure to read them out whenever Rabbi Silver takes pauses for that. If you want to stay as an attendee and not a panelist, please make use of the raise hand function when you have a question. And with that, good morning, good afternoon, Rabbi Silber.
Okay, thank you.
I don't want to keep you from teaching.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's begin with chapter 40. We're in the middle, of course, of the story of Yosef, which actually is the primary story till the very end of this book. Last we've seen Yosef is now in jail. He was placed in jail there by his Adon, as he calls him, his master, Joseph, having come to Egypt as a slave, and we have the incident with the Mrs. Potiphar, who accuses Joseph she accuses him in front of the members of the house in which she finds herself. That's one accusation. And she had a second accusation of Joseph when she speaks to her husband. The first accusation is he attempted to rape her, but the second accusation is not exactly that. The second accusation, as we understood it, he mocked me, he was with tzachek, maybe teasing, maybe as a sexual innuendo as well. But fundamentally, her complaint to the husband is that the slave that you brought is trying to lord it over me. And he doesn't know his place. That's the accusation that's made to the husband, at which point we're told the husband, Potiphar, gets angry. By Yicharapo, back in chapter 39, in the 19th verse, and he places him in jail. The term for jail that's found in verse number 20, where Joseph finds himself, it's called the Beit HaSohar, where the captives of the king are found. So it's a jail in which there are, one might say, enemies of the state, enemies of the king, are placed in that jail. And this jail is in the same house. It's in the house of Potiphar. And that's where Joseph finds himself. That is to say, Potiphar places him in a jail, which is in Potiphar's house. That itself is very interesting. One might have expected that he would summarily execute Joseph for making advances or whatever upon his wife. And not only that, he is at the end of the day, the Sar HaTabachim. Let's call him the chief butcher. And it's never quite clear exactly what he's butchering. Is it only animals? That's possible. But again, tabachim can refer to a tabach. A butcher can be butchering animals, butchering people. We don't get a sense that he might be squeamish about killing anybody. And yet, strangely enough, he places Joseph in a jail in the Beit HaSohar. At the end of the chapter, we were told that Joseph in the Beit HaSohar is given free rein by the head of the Beit HaSohar, the Sar Beit HaSohar. In verse number 20, he finds himself in the jail under the leadership of the Sar Beit HaSohar. And once again, at the end of chapter 39, that's where we concluded last time, we find that God, Hashem, that particular name of God, is with Joseph. The personal God is with Joseph. Chesed, and causes Joseph to be treated with kindness, with grace and kindness. Vayitain chino, and his chen is b'nei Sar Beit HaSohar. So we have the two words that often come together, chen and chesed. And the language, and then once again, he places things into Joseph's hand in verse number 22. Everything that was done there, he would do. And finally, in Sar Beit HaSohar, the Sar Beit HaSohar pays no attention to anything that is in Joseph's control, biyado. Basher Hashem ito, for God is with him. Masher hu oseh Hashem matzliach, and the concluding phrase of chapter 39, all that he does, God makes successful. It's never clear exactly what he does, but whatever it may be, he's successful. And we took note of the fact, it's fairly obvious, but we took note of the fact that the language that appears at the end of chapter 39, in the situation where Joseph finds himself in jail, is strikingly similar to the language that appears in the first part of chapter 39, when Joseph comes down to Egypt as a slave and step by step becomes, one might say, the master of the house of Potiphar. All of the expressions, God is with him, Vayashem et Yosef, we have that in chapter 39, verse number 2. And again, in verse number 3, we have the term, whatever he would do would be good. We have it in verse number 3. Kol asher hu oseh, Hashem matzliach biyado. We have the term matzliach at the end of chapter 39. We have the term matzliach more than once in the beginning of chapter 39. We have the expression that things are placed into Joseph's hand in the beginning of chapter 39. Vayazov kol asher lo biyad Yosef. In addition, kol yeshlo nosan biyado in verse number 4. In verse number 6, we have that at the end. Moed kol me'uma biyado. We have that same expression here at the end of chapter 39. We have, in short, we have the term chesed and chen at the end of chapter 39, that Joseph in the jail finds chesed and chen, and we have in the beginning of chapter 39. We have there, it says that Joseph finds grace or favor in the eyes of Potiphar. In short, virtually every expression at the end of chapter 39, in which Joseph is in jail, is parallel to the beginning of chapter 39, in which Joseph has a kind of meteoric rise to power in the house of the chief butcher of Egypt. In other words, to put it in these terms, Joseph is a person. It makes no difference where you put him. You can put him in the worst of circumstances, which is he is initially a slave in the house of Potiphar, and he rises to great prominence. And then even in the jail, in the side, there he finds favor with the Sar Beit HaSohar, and suddenly he has this enormous power within limits, obviously. He can't escape. But within the Beit HaSohar, he's given an enormous amount of power, of freedom, one might say. That's Joseph. Wherever he is, he's going to find a way. He rises to the top wherever you may put him. And that's how chapter 39 ends. Of course, at the end of chapter 39, he is in jail. He finds himself in jail. He did not commit a crime, quite the opposite. He acted very nobly, but be that as it may, he finds himself in jail. And now we begin our study. We continue with chapter 40. And chapter 40 has many interesting features to it. And we will take a look now at chapter 40. Chapter 40 begins, and we discussed this last week. By the way, what I said last week off the top of my head, that I believe that in the book of Genesis, the phrase Achar Hadvarim Ha'ela appears only 6 times in the book of Genesis, 3 in conjunction with Abraham and 3 in conjunction with Joseph, is actually correct. I checked it out, and what I said last week is correct. It is exactly correct. 3 times with Abraham and 3 times with Joseph. Maybe we'll pick up a little bit, but last week I thought that was very interesting in terms of the parallels between the story of Joseph on one hand and the story of Abraham on the other. We may come back to that again.
Can I say something, Rabbi Silber?
Yes?
Can I say something?
Yes.
I think I noticed that the usage of chen v'chesed, matzah chen, and so on, is usually when it's not motivated. I mean, what did he do that he matzah chen v'chesed? What is behind this? Is it his behavior, his looking? What is it? So when the narrative doesn't have any motivation, Usually it says just matzachen b'chesed, like don't ask questions, that's how it happened.
Could be so. It could be so. In this particular case, it sounds like to reinforce your point, it says that God creates the situation in which he finds chen v'chesed. There's a sense in this story, an important point that it's God who is, for whatever reason, we'll get to this, it's God that's helping
reason,
Joseph
that's
move
my
up.
point. For whatever reason, we don't know the reason actually.
Right. Correct. We'll get back to that point later. That's an important point. We'll get back to that point later. It's well said. There is no explicit reason. I mean, he's successful, that's for sure, and success breeds success. But apart from that, there does appear to be God's hand throughout this amazing rise to prominence, both in the house of Potiphar and in the jail. I'll come back to that point. So after that, after this story, after we find him in jail, Chatu melech mashke melech Mitzrayim b'ha'ofeh v'adonehem l'melech Mitzrayim. That's the first verse. After these things, so it says that the butler, the mashke, the one who gives drink, and the ofeh, the baker, sinned. And here the Torah uses the word l'adonehem, to their master, comma, to the king of Egypt. Now, it could have simply said to the king of Egypt. To their master means, first of all, they work directly for the king. But second of all, the term l'adonehem reminds us, obviously, of the term adon that appeared in the previous chapter. Potiphar is Joseph's adon. Joseph makes that point several times. The Torah makes that point several times. My adon, says Joseph, doesn't know what goes on in the house, right? The term adon is used several times in chapter 39 in reference to Potiphar. My point being that Joseph's responses in chapter 40 to the situation that he finds himself in, we should certainly connect it to his own personal experience in the house of Potiphar. He knows what it means to be working for an Adon and to be accused of disloyalty to the Adon, which is what Mrs. Potiphar accused him of. The servant, the slave that is disloyal to the master, that is inappropriate to the master. So here, once again, we have two people who sinned l'Adonehem, to their master, to the king of Egypt. Here's a point I wanted to emphasize as we begin our study, which is that when anybody reads this first verse, I think the sense we would all get is that the two of them, these two officers of the king, have conspired together against the king. It doesn't sound like there's two separate things, but rather, since the Torah puts them together and they sinned against their master, one does get the impression that there's some kind of perhaps a conspiracy of sorts. The two are working in tandem. For example, in the parallel story that we find in the Megillah, there we have exactly that. There we have the end of the second chapter of the Megillah, a story in which two of the officers of Achashverosh, one is named Bigtan and the other is named Teresh, Asher Bikshu L'shloach Yad B'melech Achashverosh, they attempted to harm, literally to stretch out the hand, to harm Achashverosh. What's very interesting is they're certainly the two together are conspiring. And not only is that interesting, but as we have noted in the past, Teresh could be seen, whatever the word Teresh means, but Teresh, Tirosh in the Bible is actually wine. Bigtan, we don't know what that means, but we do have in the book of Daniel, Patbag HaMelech, the daily bread. So we have Bigtan and Teresh, we could call them, or the officers of bread and wine, which of course is identical to the Sarah Mashkim and the Sarah Ophim. Clearly, one story plays off the other. But there, it's the two of them together who are attempting to harm the king. And Mordechai finds out, informs Esther, who informs the king about both of them, and both are hanged. Now, since we have that sort of story in our minds, let's keep that in mind, because over here, the whole point of chapter 40 is going to be that Joseph will discriminate between the Sarah Mashkim and the Sarah Ophim. But we'll come back to this point. I made this point in the past. I want to repeat it. I think it's an interesting point, which we'll get to very soon. But in any event, when you read the first verse, it does appear that the two of them act in tandem. And then the next verse is well, Vayitzov Paro al Shnei Sarisav. And Paro got angry against his two officers. Sounds like they're together. Al Sarah Mashkim vi Al Sarah Ofim. The baker and the butler and the baker. Vayitain Otam, he places them, plural, b'mishmar. Mishmar literally is a place where they are watched or guarded. And I may have mentioned this last week. So the jail, which is called the Beit HaSoar, and it's also called the place where people are asurim. You might say Beit Asurim, people are bound up or tied down. And now we have a new term, the term mishmar. And that's a term that appears later in the Bible. And mishmar later in the Bible, in the case of the one who was gathering wood, in the case of the one who was cursing, blaspheming God, I believe also in the case of the one who cursed, they put him in the mishmar, for they didn't know what to do with him. So the mishmar in those stories is a kind of holding pen. In other words, mishmar is a place in which you are kept temporarily until something happens to you. So the term mishmar, which was not used for Joseph was placed in jail, and the presumption being he will stay there possibly forever. But these two fellows, about whom Paro was angry, they're placed in a mishmar, that is, they're going to be held there for a while until Paro will decide what to do about them, and we'll get to that point. That's a very important point for the story. So here they have these two big officers, important people, that are brought to the special jail, where people that work for the king who are to be put in jail are put there. And Paro puts them both there together. Makom Asher Yosef Asur Sham, where Joseph is bound up there. Here we have the term Asur. He's tied up, he's bound up. And now we come to the next verse, which is very interesting. Verse number 4. Vayifkod Sar HaTabachim et Yosef itam, vayisharet otam, vayiyu yamim hamishmar. Suddenly, prior to this, the person in the jail, the main person in jail was the chief jailer, the Sar Beit HaSoar. And suddenly, in verse number 4, lo and behold, we have the reintroduction of Potiphar. The Sar HaTabachim appointed Joseph over them. He assigns Joseph to them, and Joseph serves them. They were in the custody, mishmar, good term, in custody for some time. And once again, you read verse number 4, and you flip back to chapter 39, we have exactly those terms in terms of Potiphar. Vayifkod, right? Here we have it, Potiphar, in the beginning of chapter 39, verse number 4, Vayafkideu al beito. He appointed him over his house. And in verse number 5, so twice we have the word lahafkid, right? So you have that, and not only that, vayisharet, when Joseph comes down as a slave, and Potiphar sees how successful he is, we are told in verse number 4, vayimtza Yosef chen be'einav, vayisharet oto, vayafkideu al beito. Now we have exactly parallel in chapter 40, verse number 4. And this gives us an insight now into why Sar HaTabachim, the question many have asked, if he suspected Joseph of disloyalty or of inappropriate behavior towards his wife, why didn't the chief butcher just butcher him? As Jacob had said earlier, when he heard Joseph is missing, Taraf Yosef, he's torn to pieces. Why didn't he tear Joseph to pieces? He's used to tearing things to pieces, animals to pieces, maybe people. But of course, he has a use for Joseph. Joseph is very useful to him. When two big shots come to jail, the Sar HaTabachim steps in there, and as Joseph do, exactly what Joseph did earlier in chapter 39. Joseph is useful to Potiphar. He doesn't want him upstairs near the wife, so he assigns him to the downstairs area with under lock and key. But Joseph is useful. Potiphar uses Joseph. Potiphar knows that Joseph can be very helpful. That's what you have over here. So he does exactly exactly the same story that we had in the beginning of 39. We have now in chapter 40, verse number 4. So Joseph is assigned. He's the misharet. And Vayafkideu, he's assigned to these two important people who are with him in Mishmar. So Mishmar is custody, they're being watched. And at some point in time, something's going to happen. That's the idea of Mishmar. Now we continue our little story. I'll stop in a few minutes to take comments and questions. Vayachalmu chalom shnehem. Ish chalomo b'layla echad. Ish kifidron chalomo. Hamashke v'ha'ofeh. Asher l'melech Mitzrayim. Asher asurim b'veit hasoar. So here we have very interesting. It says the two of them have a dream on the same night. So on one hand, it reinforces what we see till now. These two are actually one. The two of them, they're two peas in a pod. They conspire together. They're found guilty together. They're placed together. They're both under Joseph's in the same custody. Joseph deals with both of them. But this verse says, and they have dreams on the same night. But the Torah says, Ish kipitron chalomo, each one, each dream according to its own pitaron, to its own solution, or own meaning. And now for the first time, you get a sense that maybe these two people who appear to be identical and in jail for the same reasons, but maybe they're different. Maybe they're not identical, because each one may have his own particular solution. Each pitaron might be different. But then, of course, the Torah repeats it. Hamashka v'ha'ofeh, asher l'melech Mitzrayim, asher asurim. It repeats again. Yes, the two of them who both work for the king, who both are bound up in the jail. So on one hand, it sounds like it's all the same. On the other hand, there's already a hint over here that maybe they're different. And just to reflect on this for a moment, the point I think I would make at this point is the following. This is chapter 40. In chapter 41, we encounter exactly the same kind of scenario. The same but different, because in chapter 41, which will be the next set of dreams, hope we get there next week, in chapter 41, there Paro has two dreams. The first dream of Paro is about the cows, the lean cows and the healthy cows, and the lean ones swallowing up the healthy cows. And then he goes to sleep, it says, and he has another dream, the same night. He has a second dream. In the second dream, there were sheaves, there were stalks, healthy, unhealthy, sickly, and those in good shape. Once again, the unhealthy ones, the lean ones, the shriveled ones, eat up the others. He wakes up in the morning, and behold, it's a dream. And we'll get to this next week, one of the critical questions is, in Paro consults his magicians, those who can interpret dreams, and there are none who can interpret them in poter otam lifaro. None can interpret them, plural, to Pharaoh. And then the butler remembers Joseph. Joseph's brought out of jail. And what does Joseph say to Paro? Chalom Paro echadu. It's one dream. It is one dream with two parts, but fundamentally it's one dream. The magician said, the Torah says they couldn't interpret them, but there's no them. In chapter 41 at least, and that's the point. It may appear to be two, but it's really one. And in chapter 40, the interpretation is, you may think it's the same dream, but it's really two. So is it one dream? Is it two dreams? Part of the genius of Joseph is to be able to make these distinctions, to understand what appears on the surface to be one thing is actually two, what appears on the surface to be two is actually one. So the dreams, of course, are related to each other. We'll pick up on this next week. But in any event, the two of them have a dream on the same night. Fine. And now they're under the care of Joseph. Potiphar has put them under the care of Joseph. And now let's continue our story. So we're up to Vayishal, we're up to verse number 5 now. Verse number 6, I would say. Verse number 6. Vayavo alihem Yosef baboker. So Joseph approaches them in the morning. Vayarotam. Vihinam zoafim. He sees them. They're always together. He sees the two of them. And the two of them are zoafim. Zav can be angry, can be upset. I have a translation as distraught. It's a good translation. Something's wrong. You see something's wrong. They haven't said anything. You can see them. They're very disturbed. They're very troubled. They, plural, are troubled. Both of them. And he asked the officers of Pharaoh who were with him in the Mishmar, in the holding pen, in the house of his master. He said, Why do you why is your face bad? Why are you upset? What's bothering you? The two of them. Vayomru, and they said to him, Chalom chalamnu ufoterenu to. We had a dream, the two of us. There's no one to interpret the dream. We're troubled by our dream. Vayomer Alehem Yosef, Halo Elohim Pitronim, Sapru Nali. This is a very meaningful statement. Says Joseph to them, are dreams not the province of God? God can interpret. And he says, tell me your dream. Sapru Nali. And of course, this is a very interesting statement. The interpretation of dreams belongs to God. Tell me your dream. What it seems to be saying is, one can interpret this in many different ways. One could interpret it in the following way. One could say, listen, only God can interpret dreams. God knows the truth. Human beings can't really know. No human being can be guaranteed to know the truth. Only God knows the truth. Given the fact that no one can really know the truth except for God, you might as well tell it to me, because I have a good as chance as anybody else to interpret your dream, since dreams are not within the human province. That is a way to read it, but I don't think that's the best way to read it. The better way to read it seems to be something like, God will interpret your dream, tell me the dream, and maybe God will tell me the interpretation. That's what it sounds like to me. In other words, what Joseph seems to be suggesting is that somehow Joseph can be a conduit through which God will inform them of the correct interpretation. And right here at this point, I think we, the reader, we, the students, say to ourselves, we should keep this in mind. How does Joseph see himself vis-a-vis God? That's the question. Because this is maybe the first time he made this kind of a statement, but it's not going to be the last time. He will make such a statement on several different occasions. He'll tell this to Pharaoh, the same thing to Paro. It's not I who interpret dreams, it's God. Right? It's God. Once again, maybe God works through me. But later in the Joseph narrative, and this is, we'll get to this later on, he will say on more than one occasion to his brothers, after he reveals himself to the brothers, I am Joseph, and don't feel so bad what you did to me. It's true, you meant bad. It's true, you meant to hurt me. No question about it. However, God has God's plan, right? You thought to do evil, but God thought to do good. In other words, and he says this more than once, and he says this at the very end of his life. How could I possibly harm you? This is God's plan. We're part of God's plan. But of course, what he's also saying is, we're all part of God's plan, but God's plan works through Joseph. So we'll come back to this point. There are a couple of other places as well where he speaks. This is actually a very interesting statement that he makes. Halo Elohim Pitronim Sapru Nali. One might say that in general, somebody who sees himself or herself as the person through whom God speaks, such people in general, I would say, maybe this is a overgeneralization, but I'll speak for myself. When I meet such people who believe that they know exactly what God is planning, I tend not to like them too much. And I would say that Joseph is not necessarily a person who seems to get along well with other people in his social circle. Certainly when he's with the brothers and he told the brothers about his dreams, right? Which may be understood in retrospect as coming from God. But in point of fact, when you tell people you're going to bow down before me, or the sun, moon, and stars will bow down, 11 stars no less, that's not going to guarantee that they're going to necessarily embrace you. So, but this is something about Joseph that's very striking. And we got to keep this in mind as we proceed through the story. I'm going to read a couple more verses and I'll stop and take comments and questions. So now Joseph invites them both to tell me your dream. And the invitation, tell me your dream, one of them speaks up. And that's the Sar HaMashkim. Sar HaMashkim speaks up in verse number 9. Vayisaper Sar HaMashkim et chalomo Yosef. Vayomuro b'chalomi b'nei gefen u'lefonai. So he volunteers his dream first, the butler. And the dream is the following: Ubagefen shlosha sarigim, hikiporachat otanitza, hivshilu ashkulotea anavim, because paro biyadi, v'kachet anavim be'eschat otam okos paro, v'tenet akos akaf paro. Here's my dream, he says. In the dream, there's a vine in front of me, and there are 3 branches, and it's beginning to bud, and suddenly it blossoms, and it ripens into clusters of grapes. And I have the cup of paro in my hand, kos paro biyadi. I take the grapes, I press them into Paro's cup, and I place the cup in Paro's hand. That's my dream. To which Joseph gives the interpretation, Vayom lo Yosef ze pitrono. This is the interpretation. Shloshet hasarigim, shloshet yamine. The 3 branches, those are 3 days. Beyond shloshet yamim, 3 days from now, Yisa paro et roshecha. Pharaoh literally lift up your head. Veshivcha al kanecha, and restore you to your post. V'noatata kos paro biyado kamishpat harishon asher hayita mashkeu. So I just want to say, just translate this. I'll stop in a minute before we continue with Joseph's little speech. But Joseph's interpretation is, there are 2 interesting things about the interpretation. The second point is, and it comes back to what we have encountered already in chapter 39, over and over again, and that is the word yad. Remember, in chapter 39, the word yad appeared over and over again. First, everything is placed into Joseph's hands. Vayazov kol shelo biyad Yosef. Things are put in biyado. And then, in the next story of Mrs. Potiphar, Joseph loses his coat, and the coat is biyada. At the end of the chapter, Joseph in jail, things are once again placed biyado. And Joseph was sent down to Egypt, brought down to Egypt, or sold into slavery. The first, there was the thinking of killing him, and Judah said, Al tishachu yad, don't harm him. Don't be sholeach yad. So the word yad is a dominant word. And the point over here, what Joseph says to the butler is, if in your dream you're taking the cup of wine, and you're putting the cup of wine into Paro's hand, Joseph understands that to mean you're giving Paro control. Your dream is a dream of you imagine yourself giving Paro control. Well, if you give him control, says Joseph, then the likelihood is that Paro will actually take you back, because you do what Paro wants, which is you give Paro the power, you give Paro the control. That is, and the fact that the butler has spoken first and volunteered the dream suggests also that the butler, maybe subconsciously, has a sense that perhaps the interpretation of his dream is a positive one. That's one point. That's a critical point about Biyad. And the second interesting point about Joseph is that the dreams over here and with Paro have something else in common, which is that in each of the cases, Joseph's interpretation of the dream of the baker and the butler, and Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams, in each of those cases, it involves time. In the case over here, they are put with Mishmar, and Joseph understands that the number 3, refers to 3 days. Later in the chapter, at the end of the chapter, we are told that on the 3rd day, which is Pharaoh's birthday, maybe Joseph knows that, but the point of Joseph's ability to interpret has to do with his understanding of the way time works, whether it's 3 days or whether it's 7 years and 7 years, which is critical to Joseph's interpretation. And we are reminded of the fact that Joseph had his own dreams. And the second of Joseph's dreams, back in chapter 37, he dreamt that the sun, the moon, and the stars are bowing down to me. Now, we all remember that in the beginning of the Torah, in chapter 1 of the Torah, on the 4th day, when God creates the various luminaries, the Ma'orot, the great luminary, the sun, and the small one, and the stars, that the reason or the purpose of those is v'limshol bayomu v'alayla, is to reign. Moshe was a ruler, to rule over the day and night, and v'yulu moadim yamim v'shanim, and they are there to enable us to have the concept of time, whether it's the day, night, whether it's the festivals, etc. Years. So there's the sun and the moon primarily are there to enable us to develop a sense of time. And they are also described in the Torah as Mishol. They are the rulers, the Moshel. And when Joseph had the dream that the sun, the moon, and the stars, and the brother said to Joseph, Hamaloch timloch aleinu im moshol timshol banu, what Joseph is dreaming about is to be the ultimate Moshel, to be the ruler over the Moshelim, over the sun, the moon, and the stars. But there's something else about that dream in retrospect, which is to understand the way time functions. And that's critical to Joseph's interpretations, both over here, obviously, and especially when it comes to Paro, because he understands that the 7 is not 7 beings so much as 7 years. That's part of the genius of Joseph, to understand the timing. So these are the 2 elements of Joseph's interpretation, a great sense of timing and an understanding what enables you to find favor with the person in power. What enables you to find favor with the person in power is your existence going to help that person or not? It's very cold-blooded. The same way Joseph found himself in jail and not torn to pieces by the chief butcher. He has a use for Joseph. And as long as he has a use for you, whether it's Potiphar, and even more importantly, Paro. Paro has a use for Joseph. Joseph is very useful to Paro. And as long as he's useful to Paro, as we'll see, Joseph has enormous power. And the moment Paro doesn't need Joseph anymore, Joseph will find himself with no power, basically a slave. So this is very critical to the story. So the first point is he interprets, and of course correctly, that the butler is going to escape, regain his post, and he's about to make a plea to the butler. When you get out, don't forget me. But before we get to the plea to the butler, so I'll stop at this point, pause now, and take any comments or questions, but anything so far.
Yes, Rabbi Silber, this is a comment from a bit of a ways back from Aviva Davidson. She said that you asked her to remind you to discuss the significance of Joseph's coat.
Okay, I'll get back to that and fine. I'll be happy to discuss it. Go ahead. What else? I'll get back to the coat. Yes, the coat. The coat warm up. Joseph's coat or clothing comes up not so much in this chapter. It came up in the last chapter, obviously, and it comes up in the next chapter in more than one instance, because in this chapter he's summoned from jail and he changes his clothing, gets out of the jail clothing, and then when he meets Paro, he gets another set of clothing, he gets a necklace, he gets the clothing of the kingship. So Joseph is somebody who is constantly getting a new set of clothing. That's very important. Maybe I'll comment on it later in the chapter when we get to another statement Joseph makes. I hope to get to it later. What else?
Richard Shore has a question.
Yes?
Yes. So why don't we reevaluate Potiphar and give him more credit for understanding what's going on? And that Potiphar didn't actually believe his wife. He was more aware of her nature, and he understood Joseph's character as well. And so he wanted to save Joseph, yes, to serve him, but also because he didn't believe he was attempting to rape his wife. And
it's certainly possible, right?
Then we can understand his appointing him to be in charge of the Sar HaMashkim and Sar HaOphir as a political ploy to get Yosef out, because he presumably understands what the situation is, and he suspects that, well, someone might survive this, and if he can get Yosef to be in good graces with the Sar HaMashkim and Sar HaOphim, then it would be they or Paro who would get him out of jail and restore him to usefulness.
Well, that's possible. I don't know. I find that, let me just say that I don't think anything that we've suggested so far would put the Sar HaTabachim in a negative light. There's nothing
Right.
negative about the Sar HaTabachim. He sees Joseph. He understands God is with him. He constantly gives him more and more power, but it's for his own benefit as well. And yeah, it's quite possible that he doesn't, maybe he's heard this story before from Mrs. Potiphar or not.
Yeah.
But I would say that even if he thinks Joseph is guilty, I mean, fact of the matter is, Joseph is useful to him because these are two important people who come to the jail. I don't think I would necessarily assume that he thinks they're going to get him out of jail. The Sarah Mashkim and the Sarah Ophir are in a mishmar. They're only there, they're there temporarily. Something's going to happen to them. As far as Joseph is concerned, the sense I have is that he may be there the rest of his life. He's tied up there. There's no good reason to get him out. So I don't think I would necessarily assume the Sar HaTabachim wants to help him to get out. But on the other hand, there's nothing about the behavior of the Sar HaTabachim which strikes us, I think, as negative, unfair. On the contrary, he was very good to Joseph. He gives him one promotion after the next. And he does hear this story. He said, she said. The Torah never tells us that Joseph has any response. He says nothing. We're not told about a response, or even if that's possible. He hears what the wife says. He gets angry. He can't be in the same house, obviously. But so he does what you would have when you have a very good worker and you suspect him of something or other. You just transfer him to a different location. You know, he doesn't want to lose Joseph. Joseph is a terrific worker, and he gives him the same job actually. That was my. But I don't think I ever suggested that the Chumash says negative statements about the Sar HaTabachim. I don't think that's the case. But Joseph does understand, I think, that, you know, if you're useful to somebody, he's going to want to keep you around. And if you're not useful to somebody, like Paro, for example, he will dismiss you. They have done, the Torah is clear, they have done something, the Torah says chatu, they sinned. They did something inappropriate, whether conspiring against him, or we're never told what it is. But the Torah uses the word chet. And when you conspire against a king who has ultimate power, it's clear that, you know, Paro can do whatever he pleases, and he does. He's going to execute the Sar HaOphim, that's for sure. I'll come back to the Sar HaOphim, but all right, anybody else for comment?
Yes,
I would
just
like
just
to
one.
add something.
Can I just add something from the chat and then Sarah?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just from the chat, Justin Hornstein asked, how is the term matzliach being repurposed here? We have Eliezer asking God for God being matzliach derech, and now it is a general term of personal achievement.
Right. So I already alluded to that a couple of weeks ago. I'll repeat what I said then. I said that the word matzliach is found in the Bible in both senses. It's found to be successful in general, and it is true that the word matzliach appears earlier with Abraham's servant and elsewhere in the Bible in terms of being on a particular path, a successful path. And the point that I made a couple of weeks ago in terms of Joseph is that we the reader may see the story as things sort of happening haphazardly to Joseph. That's a way to see it. He comes to Egypt, he happens to find himself in the house of Potiphar, he succeeds there, there's the Mrs. Potiphar, he ends up in jail, he happens to be the baker and the butler, etc. They're going to forget about him, he remembers 2 years later, but there's another way to read the story, and that is to see Joseph, that's what I alluded to before, this is part of God's plan. The entire story of Breshit can be seen as a function of human behavior, but it can be seen equally as God's plan. And God's going to use Joseph to carry out God's plan. If you look at it that way, he is on a path. He may not know he's on a path, but he's on a very, very direct path. And that's the story back even in chapter 37, when Joseph is lost. And a mysterious man finds him and sends him to the brothers. The mysterious Ish, can be seen as God's messenger, God's angel, God's messenger. So there are two ways to read Genesis. One is everything that happens is a product of human behavior, but there's another way to read Genesis, equally plausible, which is it's part of God's plan. And then Latzliach does carry the other meaning of to be on a path, because he's on a path. He doesn't know that necessarily, but he is on a path. That's what I said a couple of weeks ago. This Sarah, and then we'll continue. Yes, Sarah.
Since you stressed the fact that Sarofim, Sarah Mashkim are as if two, but actually they are one, I wanted to say that this is very characteristic of every folk story, because folk stories don't have two heroes and they don't have two antagonists. So if you have more than one, they usually function as a collective. They are not different because of the simplicity of folk narratives.
Okay, thank you for that comment. And I actually will come back to that point later on. I have something to say about that.
If there's time for one more comment before moving
let us now
on.
continue. Yes, go ahead. Yes, I'm
Debbie.
listening.
David, I wanted to say that it just strikes me as interesting that Yosef had been totally emotionally deaf to his brothers' faces when he told them the story, when he told them his dream. And yet here are strangers that he's taking care of or in charge of, and he notices the difference in their faces. So he's changing. Yosef is changing.
That is possible. It's also possible there's something else. This is his job. He's there to serve them. So the point is, their welfare is his job. With the brothers, their welfare is not his job. They're his brothers, his older brothers. He has this revelation, and he feels he has to tell them for whatever reason, and he does. So I'm saying what you're saying is possible, but it's also possible. It's a different situation. If your job is to care for somebody, which is what his job is, so he has to see if they're not well. Remember that in the book of Daniel, you have this over there, right? There's the book of Daniel, and in there's a story. I'm blocking some of the details, but no, I think maybe it was Nehemiah. The king looks at Nehemiah and says, "Why are you upset? What's the reason?" I think it's to Ezra and Nehemiah. And when the king says that to Nehemiah says to himself, because if you appear before the king with a downcast face or whatever it is, the king might begin to suspect, what's not right here? You're serving the king. You have to be happy all the time. So when you're operating in that sphere, it's very different. His job is to serve these people. And when he sees they're unhappy, that's not going to be good for Joseph either. In other words, he's concerned about that. It's his job, and it could be dangerous. What's the problem? And then they explain. So I think that the situations are different. One could see it as Joseph changing in some sense, and one could see it as a function of the scenario in which Joseph finds himself. Okay, let's continue a little more now. So Joseph is still speaking to the bird, and then he adds, seemed to be an interpretation of the dream. In verse 14, he says, please remember me, when things go well for you. So you're going to be restored to your post. It's going to be good for you. It's going to be told. When that happens, so show kindness to me. Remind me unto Pharaoh. And get me out of this house. He calls the jail a bayit. I'll come back to that. And then he adds, for in truth I have surely been stolen from the land of the Hebrews. Here also I have done nothing. And they placed me inside the pit. He calls the jail a bar. We have a lot of words for jail here. We have mishmar, we have soar, we have asurim, we have bayit, and we have bar. Interesting. So let me make a few observations about this speech of Joseph. At the end, after he interprets the dream, he says, listen, you're going to get out. I want you to do me a favor. It's going to be good. I've given you the good news. And when you get out, remember me unto Pharaoh. Okay. Let's leave that out for a second. And then he adds, for I have been stolen from the land of the Hebrews. Here too, he says, here too I did nothing. Kisamu oti babar, that they placed me in the pit. Now we recall that in the first story, back in chapter 37, he was also placed in the pit. So calling the jail the pit is a way to reinforce what Joseph is saying. He says, listen, I'm a victim. I was a victim in the land of the Hebrews, and I'm a victim here. In each case, they put me in a pit. And in each case, I did nothing to deserve it. Now, when you read this verse, you say to yourself, I say to myself, well, it may be true that in the story of Mrs. Potiphar, you certainly did nothing to deserve it. You should get a Medal of Honor. So certainly you've been a victim in the Mrs. Potiphar story. But what about the other story? What about the story in the land of the Hebrews? Is it true that you did nothing to deserve it? I don't think the Torah suggests that at all. The Torah certainly suggests that the brothers have misbehaved. That's for sure. But the Torah tells us about Joseph that, first of all, he brings back evil report to his father, which for the Torah is a big negative. I'm not sure the brothers know that, but what they do know is that he insists on not only having the dreams, which bothers them, but telling them the dreams. And he does it twice. He was rebuked, in fact, by his father. So the idea that here too he did nothing, that suggesting that there he did nothing, that I think one can raise a question. Is that actually the case? And if in fact one believes that it's not true, that in the story of Joseph, he's just the victim, but rather it's true that everybody in that story has some culpability, both Jacob for favoring Joseph and giving him the coat, the special coat, and the brothers obviously for causing his sale and the attempted murder, and then Joseph for his Lashon Hara, for bringing evil report, and for, in a sense, taunting them, whatever he thinks. Does he really have to tell them the dreams? So if that be the case, then there's a striking contrast between the Joseph of this chapter and chapter 39, the Joseph narrative, as it continued from after chapter 37, and the chapter which preceded it was the story of Yehuda and Tamar. In the story of Yehuda and Tamar, it's all about the person who's able to confess. That's the story of Judah and Tamar. Yes, he misbehaves, there's no question. But at the end of the day, he says, Tzadkam Imeni. And when he says Tzadkam Imeni, when he confesses and take responsibility, something else happened to him, which is that the coat, the ptilim, the coat, and the staff and the seal, which represent Judah, which are with her, are returned to Judah. The symbols of leadership, which were with Tamar, who's the true leader, then are returned to Judah. And now over here, in the story over here, we have somebody who's incapable of saying chatati. He has to insist that he was even innocent over there. And such a person, it's very striking. To come back to Aviva's comment earlier, he never gets the same clothing back. He always gets a new set of clothing, but he never gets the same ones back. Because the Achilles heel of Joseph is the inability to say, I've acted wrongly, I've acted improperly. He says quite the opposite. I did nothing wrong. They put me in the pit. Such a person can move forward in life, but he can never actually get back to where he was once. Only through confession do you do that. So the striking contrast between the man who's able to regain his own clothing, which are the symbols of leadership, vis-a-vis Joseph, who always gets a new set of clothing, but never gets the same set. That can be reflective of this particular verse, Gunov Gunavti Me'eretz Hayivrim. That's what I wanted to say to Aviva in terms of the clothing. So that's related, I think, to this verse. And now there's another point I want to make before I'll stop and take some comments, and then we'll continue with the chapter, which is verse number 14. Kim zachartani itcha kasher yitav lach vasita imodi chesed. There are 2 points to be made about this. First of all, in the various midrashim about Joseph, the Agadot and midrashim about Joseph, it's fair to say that the midrash takes Joseph to task for his asking the Butler to help him. I wanted to make a comment about that, why the midrash actually, not just one midrash, many midrashim take him to task. After all, what's wrong? The guy's going to get out of jail in 3 days. He has Pharaoh's ear because he's serving Pharaoh. He has Pharaoh's ear. So say, listen, you're going to talk to Paro, you're going to serve him the wine, you're going to his butler, you're going to see him 3 times a day or whatever. At one point in time, mention to him, this guy in jail who's a good guy, innocent person, doesn't deserve to be there. He's a good guy. Maybe Pharaoh can help him, get him out. What's wrong? But I think what's bothering the Midrash is the following. Nothing's wrong with that. What bothers the Midrash is that what Joseph says to the Sarah Mashkim, V'yasituna imadi chesed, do chesed. The word chesed has appeared with Joseph actually in terms of God. Vayete love chesed, right? So chen and chesed. It's God who has been doing chesed for Joseph all along. And what is very striking is what we don't find Joseph ever doing, and we did find his father and grandfather and great-grandfather do it, is pray. He never turns to God. He may see himself as God's instrument, but he never actually prays. Joseph only has one prayer in the Bible, and this is it, right here. Asitana imadi chesed. I mean, the word chesed, it's what Jacob sends his slave out to find a wife, not Jacob, Abraham sends the servant to find a wife. This coming week's parsha, the servant prays to God. Hashem Elokei Adoni Avraham. I say chesed. Please God, do chesed. That's the prayer of the servant. That's how our Amidah begins. Zocher chasdei avot, right? So it's that's what the Medrash is bothered by. It's one thing to ask someone for help, but my goodness, someone's been helping you all along. Why don't you turn to God for help? That's number one. That's the first point. And the second critical point over here, and in this verse, he asked the butler to remember him. The last verse of chapter 40, of course, is V'lo zachar sar mashkim et Yosef vayishkacheu, that the butler did not remember Joseph. Quite the opposite. He totally forgot him. And here we come to a very important point about the story of Joseph. And we'll encounter this in several different ways as we proceed through the Joseph story. And of course, the Megillat Esther picked up on this as well. And that is that Egypt is a place which has no memory. There's no memory. He forgets it. People don't remember. Memory means that what I do today is in light of what's happened in the past. And Mitzrayim is not the kind of a place. Mitzrayim is the place in which you are functioning for the moment, like Mrs. Potiphar. What have you done for me lately? So we have to keep this in mind, that the idea of memory or a place which has no memory will be central to the story of Mitzrayim. Let me stop and take comments and questions.
One comment, just to start things off, one comment from earlier in the chat from Jennifer Malvin. She asked, why did the text mention that the baker and cupbearer dreamed at night? Jennifer, did I get that right?
Well, that's when people usually have dreams. I don't think that's
yeah. I just didn't know why they then said, because you taught us how every word is significant, so we would have assumed it was at night. So why would they have to say
I don't know.
it was at
It's
night?
a good question. I mean, he sees them first thing in the morning. I suppose that's.
I guess
I don't
for
know.
time placing. Then, yeah.
Maybe since you asked the question, I'll suggest an answer. The answer may be nonsense, but I'll suggest it anyway. It's the privilege of being a teacher. You can sometimes say nonsense, and I never intend to say nonsense. It may be nonsense, but I'm thinking about something else. The word boker is striking. Joseph sees them in the boker. Since you asked the question, now what does the word boker mean? The word boker means morning, right? Vayerev vayiboker. But erev and boker, why does boker mean morning? Because the word erev, actually in Hebrew, la'arev means when things are together, when you can't distinguish things. But the word boker, levaker, in biblical Hebrew means to distinguish. A bikoret in the Chumash is an investigation. And maybe baboker is actually a hint at the fact that what Joseph is going to be able to do is to distinguish between the two of them. So perhaps that's the point, that it takes place baboker, vayatam baboker, and really hinting at the fact that the genius of Joseph is the ability to make distinctions. So maybe that's why the Boker has been introduced to the story. Thank you for the question. I didn't
Oh,
think of that
thank you
before.
so much.
That's certainly it could be. Let's put it that way. It's possible. You know what I mean? But the point about memory, that is an incredibly important point in the Joseph story. Joseph himself will name his first son Menashe, which means forgetfulness. The Sar Hamashkim will forget Joseph. Get 3 days later, by the way. How can you forget? Guy gave you this great news and you forget. But it will turn out, of course, this is part of the story, that his forgetting him is very good. Because if he would remember him right away and Joseph gets out of jail and then disappears and who knows where he goes, maybe you can't locate him. You know, there was once a guy in jail a couple of years ago, who knows where he is today. But he's going to remember him at the time when Pharaoh needs Joseph. So his forgetting him for minimally 2 years is actually a very good thing, even though at the time it appears to be a terrible thing. But in reality, it's actually quite a good thing because it enables Joseph to catapult himself from being in jail with a life sentence, perhaps jail in the basement of Potiphar, to the standing before Paro with the opportunity to interpret Paro's dream and to get out of jail and to be given a position of great authority. That's certainly the case. I did want to make a comment before other people can speak up, and that is when Joseph speaks to the butler, he says to the butler, please do chesed, remind me unto Pharaoh, his kartani, v'otzeitani min habayit hazeh. And it's interesting that in this verse, he calls the jail a bayit. And I wanted to reflect on that for a moment. And that is, remember, the jail over here is in Potiphar's house. Joseph came to the house of Potiphar, and he's inside Potiphar's house. For example, 39 verse 8, he's in the height of Potiphar. That's verse number 2. And then in verse number 5, once again, the second time. Third time, the house. And the blessing of God extends. And once again, the bayit, right? When Joseph speaks to Potiphar's wife, Mrs. Potiphar, Hey Adoni wa yadaiti ma babayit, in verse number 8. Verse number 9, Enenu gadol babayit hazemi meni. No one is great in the bayit, right? And then later on, Vayavo habayto lasot mulachto, ein sham anshe habayit babayit. Over and over, I didn't count the number, it's over and over and over again, the bayit. And I think the point now, when Joseph says to the butler, you know, get me out of this bayit. And suddenly you have a different take on the house of Potiphar. Yes, Joseph was in this place of enormous power. He was in, the province of Potiphar. He was in charge of the house and the field. And at the end of the day, though, the Chumash may be saying the bayit of Potiphar is in fact a jail. Not only downstairs is the jail, but being caught in this world of Potiphar, you are in fact in jail. And I think the parallel is what we encounter in the book of Esther. Because in the book of Esther, Megillat Esther, in the second chapter, the women are all brought from all parts of the country. They're brought into Achashverosh's harem, and they prepare for a year to meet Achashverosh, to sleep with Achashverosh for a whole year. And the point of that chapter is that, yes, they're given all the perfume and this and that. At the end of the day, though, the way the Megillah presents it, where are you essentially? You've been brought to this harem, and that's where you are for the rest of your life. You can't escape it. One woman may be chosen, the others will be his concubines or whatever. But basically, and the without getting to the description the Megillah uses for that scenario, it is in fact the Beit HaNashim, the Beit HaPilagshim, the Bayit is essentially pretty much a jail. And the women are taken by force. They don't volunteer to go, and they're brought to the jail. And Joseph over here, when he says, get me out of this Bayit, he's referring to the jail. But the fact of it is the jail is just the bottom floor of the house. So the point is that when he says, get me out of this Bayit, the Torah wants us to remind ourselves that Joseph can't stay in his Bayit. For Joseph, what Joseph has to become, he can't be in the Bayit. The Bayit is, in fact, whether bottom floor, middle floor, or top floor, it is, in fact, another word for jail. It's not different than the bar, or the Beit HaSoar, or the Beit HaSubim, etc., or the Mishmar. These are all synonyms for the same thing, which is the jail. And Joseph has to, one way or the other, get out of this jail. Now, he asked the Sarah Mashkim to help him, to remember him. Sechartani, his Kartani, remember, remind Pharaoh, whatever. It's not going to happen right away, but that's where Joseph finds himself. And the Torah is very interested in not forgetting this, that being in Mitzrayim, first of all, is problematic, and being in Potiphar's house is more problematic. Okay, is there anybody else for a comment? If not, we'll move forward. We have a few minutes still to go.
Maybe to be in Paro's house or palace is also a kind of being a servant in jail. Can he leave Egypt? Can he do what he wants?
Of course not. Of course he can't. He can't even leave Egypt at the end when he wants to bury his father.
So
Paro sends his, he has to beg to leave. His children and women are left behind with the animals as hostages. It's the same as the second Paro. There's no difference. He doesn't understand that till the end, but of course, being in Mitzrayim, being in Paro's house, you're a very well-paid slave. But at the end of the day, you have all kinds of perks, and you have the fancy chariot, you have the Rolls Royce. At the end of the day, from the Torah's perspective, you're a slave, and you can't get out. Joseph makes that clear. Joseph dies and is buried in Egypt. He begs his brothers, someday I'll get out of here. So that's certainly the case. The house of Potiphar is simply a parallel, a reflection of the larger Bayit in which Joseph will find himself, which is the house of Paro. Okay, let me just take a couple more minutes here, and I'll stop with this. So this is the butler. We're not going to finish the chapter now. Let me make one more comment, though. The next verse is verse number 16. Vayar Sarah Ofim Kitov Potar. The baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation. Vayomer El Yosef Afani Bacharomi V'nei Shlosha Salei Chari Aroshi Vasal Elyon Mikol Machel Paro Baselfer V'yof Ochel Otam Minasal Miaroshi. Says the baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, probably hopeful he'll get also a good interpretation, but his dream is different. In his dream, there was baskets on his head, and the top baskets, all kinds of food for Paro to eat, and the birds were eating out of the basket above my head. So that's a different dream, because in this dream, obviously, the food isn't going to Paro. The food is going to the birds, and they're not being placed in Paro's hand. The basket is sitting on top of his head, and of course, Joseph will give his interpretation, which is quite unfavorable to the baker. I want to make one comment now, and we'll conclude with this one comment. And next week we'll finish this story of the baker and the butler, and I have some other reflections about chapter 37 that I think are interesting. I'll get back to that next week, but I did want to make one comment here about the dream about the baker. Obviously, the baker, unlike the butler, is not putting anything into Pharaoh's hand, and therefore we suspect, and we'll find out in a couple of verses, he will meet a very unfortunate end on the part of by the hand of Paro. But I do want to make one comment about the baker. So the butler is going to make it to safety, back to his post, and the baker will be executed. There are a couple of things to say. I want to make one point. Remember back to chapter 39. Chapter 39, when Joseph finds himself in the house of Potiphar. So the Torah said that Potiphar sees that Everything Joseph does is successful for Potiphar, so he gives him free hand. He pays no attention to what Joseph does, except for the bread that he would eat. Strange expression. He didn't care what he did at all, except for the bread he would eat. When it came to the bread, maybe eating with Joseph or whatever, that he did care about. So Joseph perhaps couldn't eat with Potiphar. That would suggest a kind of equality. But short of that, had everything else. But I would say the following. The fact that the Torah singles out, I think suggests something about the larger story. In other words, everything is like so, with one exception. But of course, sometimes that one exception is not a small exception. Sometimes the one exception is, in a certain sense, more significant than the rule. And when it comes to the larger narrative of Egypt, okay, what essentially, when Paro will have his dreams, okay, the thing that spurs Paro's dreams in chapter 41 is the end of chapter 40. The end of chapter 40 is the execution of the baker. If he kills the baker, executes the baker, it means that as far as Paro is concerned, the lechem, because the baker's in charge of the lechem is not in the control of Paro. It's on top of this guy's heads, and the birds are getting the lechem. And that's what motivates the dreams of Paro. And the one who's going to be able to figure out how do you put Paro in control of the lechem is the one who will achieve power, because that's what Paro wants. He wants the lechem. And that's already hinted at. It's already hinted at verse when it comes to Potiphar and Joseph. Gave him everything except for the lechem. But the lechem, it will turn out, is the absolutely critical piece of, is the critical thing that determines how much control you have. And of course, Joseph is the one who's going to figure out how to get all the lechem under Paro's control. And then once he figures that out, that will give Joseph enormous power, because same as the house of Potiphar. If you make Potiphar happy, you get more opportunity, get more freedom, more responsibility. And the same is true of Joseph. Joseph will be the wisest of all. He's going to figure out how to give Paro control of the lechem, which he doesn't have. The proof is he had to execute the baker. That's the end of chapter 40. And the next verse will be Mikesh Natayim Yamim, 2 years later, but it's the next verse. So those two stories are actually related to each other. We have 2 minutes now. Let me make one last point over here, and I'll stop, about the baker. One could ask the question, I already partially answered the question, but one should take note of the fact, when we studied the Megillah together, I made this point, I'll repeat it. Why is it that when it comes to the baker and the Bigton and Teresh, so they conspire against Achashverosh and they're both killed. Mordechai informs Achashverosh about Bigton and Teresh, they're both killed. Why is it important over here to have a baker altogether? Have just the butler. There was a butler in jail with Joseph. He had a bad dream. Joseph told him the dream. He forgot Joseph. He remembers 2 years later. What is the function of the baker? Why need a baker? So I already gave one answer, that not having control of the lechem is a fundamental theme of the story. But there is a second answer as well. And the second answer is this, that without the baker, it doesn't prove how smart Joseph is. Because the fact that Joseph said you're going to live, there's no downside to that. Because if he gets out and lives, okay, that's great. And if Paro decides to kill him, dead men tell no tales. So what's lost? There's no downside to saying to the baker, the butler, you're going to make it. But to tell the baker, you're not going to make it. What if the baker is summoned 3 days later and Paro says, get your job back? You can still be, then you have a lifelong enemy who's the important person in the land of Egypt. That's dangerous. For Joseph to tell the baker, you will die in 3 days, that is very dangerous. You'll die and the birds will eat your flesh. The baker, if he survives, is not going to forget that. So that will demonstrate Joseph's ability to interpret dreams. And in point of fact, when the butler speaks to Paro about Joseph, these incredible Jew who can interpret dreams, he dafka mentions the baker. Me and the baker were there. I was saved. He was hanged. he mentions that because that's the proof of Joseph's ability to interpret dreams. We'll have to continue with this next time and move into the dreams of Paro. I have time for 1 or 2 comments or questions, and we'll stop.
One comment from just from the Facebook chat was from Ozzy from Ozzy Orbach. He noted that like when prison becomes home, when you are in prison long enough, it becomes home.
That is certainly true. We know there are people who when they get out of prison, they want to go back. That is true. But as far as Joseph is concerned, and Joseph has a mission, whether known to Joseph or not, he certainly has a mission. But Joseph is Jacob's favorite child. Joseph is part of the family. Joseph can't stay in jail. Joseph has to take his place alongside his brothers. That's the larger narrative, which is clear. It's not someone you can simply disregard. Jacob's vision is building the house, and the house of Jacob includes all of his sons. So, of course, you could become comfortable in any situation. And there are many people who spend most of their lives in prison, and for a lot of them, they can't live on the outside, and even don't want to live on the outside. Sad to say. But in any event, having said that, that won't work for Joseph. Nor does Joseph want to stay in jail. He wants to get out of jail, clearly. He has big dreams, and jail is not a place where he can fulfill his own dreams. So he hasn't forgotten those dreams. The sun, the moon, and the stars aren't bowing down to you in Potiphar's cellar. So he has to get out. Let me stop at this point then, and we will continue next week. You have any other comments, Kayla? Information?
That's it from the chat.
Okay.
I just want to remind people that if you want to keep learning with Drisha, we have more classes you can find out at drisha.org/classes. Our next class is with Samuel Evans. And if you want to learn more with Rabbi Silber, he has a class on tefillah at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time on Mondays.